Hello, witches. It's Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. Summertime is perfect for sporting events, whether famous international affairs such as the Olympics or simply friends playing softball in the park. But with many things in life, there can be a darker side to these games. Fierce competition, greed, cheating, people willing to go to any lengths to win, even at the cost of someone's life. And when those tragic events take place at stadiums and sporting arenas, it's no wonder some people never leave and remain a fan for life and in death. First, fatal ambition, followed by the most haunted baseball stadium in the US. Then, finally fight for your life. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask for your support. As you likely know, the media world has been in transition and the shifting sands of monetization have made it difficult for podcasts to make money. Although I realize you hear a lot of ads when you listen, the value of the ads has fallen, so much so that we are now running more ads and making less money. To help us continue to produce the weekly podcast and video, we are asking fans to join our Patreon as a paid subscriber. It's only $5 per month. That's just over $1 per episode, and it's one of the ways you can help Something Scary and myself continue to grow and tell you scary stories. Go to patreon.com/snarled and join us today. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful for the support of all of our listeners. So, want to hear something scary? Deadly games. Some competition can be healthy and push you to achieve your very best. But when the pressure becomes too much, it can lead to fatal mistakes, as in this story inspired by Alice. Again, Lily? Straighten up. That's right. Now work on that spine. Lily finally perfected the move her mom was insisting she practice over and over before collapsing onto the couch, exhausted. Lily's mom had dreamed of becoming a professional ballerina, but despite years of training, she never made it to the top. Now, she was determined to fulfill her dreams, vicariously through her 12-year-old daughter instead. Secretly, Lily didn't even really enjoy ballet that much. Her own aspirations for the future filled with books and research. However, she had learned from a very young age that the only way to make her mother proud was by dancing. And so she did. They didn't have a lot of money, so oftentimes, Lily only participated in small local recitals and contests. But this wasn't enough for her mother. She scoured the internet and newspapers, looking for the contest with the biggest cash prize. In the meantime, she required that Lily practice and practice while she barked orders at her, only praising her daughter when she perfected a move. She barely seemed to care that her daughter was perpetually tired, her grades suffering and her friendships almost non-existent. One day, her mom learned there was a talent show downtown and the winner would receive a $10,000 prize. She insisted Lily would have to rehearse overtime, as this was a big deal. That money would mean a great deal to them. She had Lily train longer hours, to the point where she couldn't feel her toes. Eventually, her ballet shoes started to fall apart, making practice not only even harder, but also extremely painful. She desperately needed them to be replaced, but they just didn't have the money. One evening, when Lily's mom was walking home from a late shift at her waitressing job, she saw some men hurriedly throwing boxes into the dumpster behind the diner. She walked up to them and asked, "What are you guys doing?" They ignored her before throwing one last box into the dumpster and running off. Lily's mom was curious, so she peered into the trash and was surprised to see a pile of shoe boxes. She picked up one on the top of the pile. The box itself didn't seem busted or dirty, just a little old. She wondered if just maybe it might contain vintage shoes so she could try to sell. She opened it with anticipation and let out a gasp. Inside the box were brand new pink satin ballet shoes. She took them out and amazingly, they were the exact same size as Lily. She couldn't believe it and took them home excitedly, thinking her luck was finally turning around. But what she didn't know was the real reason why the men had thrown them in the trash. Lily was surprised by the fancy, expensive-looking shoes, but knew well enough not to ask too many questions. She thanked her mom and took them into the den to practice the dance for the competition. Strangely, the shoes felt as though they had been handcrafted, just for her. They were so comfortable. She twirled around the room, suddenly remembering all of the complex and confusing steps her mother had insisted on choreographing, as if it were a routine for a beginner. Her mom watched in amazement. "Oh yes, Lily," she cheered. "You are wonderful." The obvious pride and joy in her mom's voice filled Lily with a genuine sense of accomplishment and happiness. "I need to go grab my cell and record this," she said. Lily's mom rushed out of the room, closing the door behind her. Lily was suddenly overwhelmed by the need for a hug. She rushed over to the door to follow her mom, but she couldn't. She tried again. But as much as her brain was telling her body to do one thing, her body was not obeying. She continued to whirl around, her feet refusing to stop. It was as if they were being controlled and not by her, filling her with a sense of dread. Her legs started to cramp, but she could not stop dancing. She continued to dance until her toes bled and her ankles felt like they were broken. Sure enough, when she looked down, her pretty pink shoes were stained dark with blood. She silently sobbed as she continued to spin and spin. Lily's mom returned, but when she tried to open the door, she couldn't. There was no lock, but for some reason the door was stuck fast. She wiggled the handle and called to Lily to let her in. When there was no answer, she began to bang and kick at the wood. She sprung open and she stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her daughter. How she danced so elegantly. With her eyes closed, she'd never know. "Smile," she called to Lily. But her daughter didn't open her eyes, smile, or even stop dancing. That was when Lily's mom saw the streaks of blood on the floorboards, and then stains on the shoes, and the shards of bone protruding from Lily's legs. "Lily!" she screamed, but her daughter continued to dance, although her body was not drooping, like a sad marionette. Her mom rushed over and tried to stop her from dancing, but her feet just carried on and on. Although she couldn't understand how or why, Lily's mom realized the shoes were somehow responsible. Despite putting up a great fight, through her own battered, bruised, and bleeding fingers, she managed to remove the shoes and threw them out the den door. Then she held her daughter in her arms and wept. Lily's feet were unrecognizable, now just two bloody stumps of mangled bone and tissue. Shards of splintered bone poked out of the skin of both legs. Lily had passed out from the pain, but she woke once more to look at her mother and say, I hope you're proud of me now." She took a final breath and then died from the massive blood loss. When Lily's mom went to retrieve the shoes from where she had thrown them, they were nowhere to be seen, as if they had walked off all on their own, ready to find a new unsuspecting owner. Have you ever felt so pressured to do something that you would resort to extreme measures? Have you ever practiced for something so hard that you ended up hurting yourself? Or worse, someone else? Some famous baseball teams are known for their legends and curses, such as the Yankees and Red Sox, but many stadiums boast tales of hauntings, especially when older buildings were demolished in the process, as in this story inspired by real encounters from Innovative Field Stadium in Rochester, New York. Suki was a huge sports fan. She played, watched, and lived for sporting events, and her favorite of all was baseball. So when she got the chance to intern at her local newspaper and cover sports during the baseball season, she was over the moon. Innovative Field was home to the Rochester Red Wings, and Suki would be attending games and reporting back for the online coverage. After she'd been doing this for weeks, she was invited by one of the coaches, Larry, to stay behind after an evening game and hang out with some of the team. Thinking this would be a great opportunity to interview some of the players, Suki happily agreed. When the game ended thankfully with another epic win, Larry asked Suki if she'd like a tour of the stadium. Suki smiled gratefully, but said she'd already had one, thank you. "But was it at night?" Larry asked. The ballpark is always different at night, and you might even get a different angle for one of your stories," he suggested. Now Sookie was intrigued. One of the designated hitters, Josh, came along too, so she asked him a few questions as they walked around, recording his answers on her cell phone. Larry was showing her, in great detail, various things of interest when they began to near the end of the hallway. Beyond the hall is one of our training areas and equipment stores. As you can imagine, these places are well used, but are also kept impeccably tidy. He went on to explain there were strict forfeits and punishments given for players who didn't tidy up after practice. Yet sometimes, even though the area had been checked and was absolutely spotless, when the building was opened up the next morning, it was like a bunch of kindergartners had gotten loose in there. "So who's causing the mess?" Sookie asked, puzzled. The men looked at one another and she noticed Josh looked a little uncomfortable. "Well, some of the team thinks it's Whiskers." Sookie looked incredulous for a moment. "Whiskers? Do you mean to say a cat gets into the equipment room and throws stuff around?" She laughed, but neither Larry nor Josh joined in. "Whiskers ain't a cat. He's a ghost," admitted Josh. "We call him that since he has these big sideburns and mustache. At least that's what people who have seen him have told us." Sookie opened her mouth to reply, then shut it, not trusting herself with a reply. Larry then filled her in about how Innovative Field was built on top of a bunch of old buildings that had been torn down in order for the stadium to exist. Amongst them were a schoolhouse, paper mill, and a warehouse. Although they couldn't attribute anything in particular to the demolition of old buildings to create the new site, several members of the team and staff had experienced something inexplicable. After some digging, they discovered what some believed the grumpy janitor at the paper mill, who passed away before it was torn down, and hadn't left with the bricks and mortar. He didn't even recognize the hallways he was forever doomed to roam, which upset him. So rather than clean, he indulged in some poltergeist activity, making a mess for the living and cleaning crew to deal with. Sookie scoffed. She was definitely a skeptic. "I don't believe in ghosts," she quipped. "But it could make a fun piece for the paper. So where to next?" "Let's go up to the offices," said Larry. He started walking up the stairs and Josh held his arm out in front of him, allowing Sookie to go next, then he reluctantly followed. It was very quiet, which was to be expected. The fans had all dispersed from the stadium, the majority of the players and staff too. There were only a handful of people left on the site and the offices were empty. As they headed down the corridor towards Larry's office, they heard the whir of the elevator kick in. The trio stood in front of the doors watching the light go from 1 to 2 and the doors opened. There was no one inside. Sookie rolled her eyes. "Nice one, guys. What else are you going to try and spook me with?" Chuckling to herself, she carried on down the hallway. Larry and Josh looked at one another. "We're the only ones here, right?" asked Larry. Josh nodded. They hurried away from the elevator and joined Sookie by the office. Larry opened the door, and the three of them were about to walk into the room when there was a loud bang from the inside. Larry quickly flicked on the overhead light just as a second bang sounded, and this time they saw several books and files fly off the desk and land on the floorboards. This time Sookie looked as shocked as the two men. "What the hell was that?" She rushed into the office, expecting to find someone hidden behind the desk or see some sort of string attached to the files. But there was nothing. "I think we better wrap this up for the night," stated Larry, and as Sookie began to walk back out of the room, she suddenly felt something extremely cold on the back of her neck, like someone was blowing with ice-cold breath. Her eyes widened, and as she quickened her steps back into the hallway, a dark shadow lunged at her from the corner. Sookie screamed, plowing through Larry and Josh, and almost sent them flying as she raced from the room and down the corridor and straight down the stairs. She didn't stop running until she was in the brightly lit foyer of the stadium overlooking the dark parking lot. As she bent over and caught her breath, the two men appeared beside her, both looking equally shook. Sookie didn't even say goodbye as she headed out into the lot and over to her car. Her hand was shaking as she opened the door when she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She whipped around, ready to tell Larry or Josh that she had had enough, but there was no one there. That was it. She jumped in her car and drove off, vowing from now on only to cover daytime games and events. People continue to report sightings of the mysterious ghostly janitor. Members of the Rochester Paranormal Society deem it officially haunted, even claiming to have captured a spectral being on camera. But that wasn't all. Along with the disgruntled former paper mill employee, they encountered another far more hostile presence. Something that might not just throw a few balls around to make a mess for the cleaning crew. Who is the malevolent, otherworldly guest at this particular Field of Screams, bidding their time before revealing their true purpose, and what havoc are they waiting to cause? Have you ever heard of an unexplained story from your local or college stadium? Have you ever experienced something supernatural yourself at a sporting event? Stories of games involving a fight for your life are not new, but became popular again over the last decade or so thanks to the success of the Hunger Games. The idea of a future where spectator events harken back to the gladiatorial games of the distant past might not be as fantastical as we might imagine, as in this story inspired by The Running Man, written by Janine Pipe. As she passed through unfamiliar territory, the shaking began to worsen. Cold beads of sweat pooled in the dip of her lower back. Having read The Running Man, Heather knew this couldn't end well. There'd been no training, she had no street smarts. She never had to fight for anything. In fact, for her entire existence, everything had been handed to her on a plate. Until now. Weeping, she looked out of the window of the speeding vehicle. She didn't have a clue where they were headed. No one had told her anything. Why would they? She was just an animal to them. Passing the sights at an alarming speed revealed nothing. Of course, most of the land looked the same way now anyway. Heather wished for someone to talk to ask why, of all the survivors in her area, she had been selected. In the rush and confusion, her parents had been unable to explain. One moment she was home with family, friends, living in a perpetual state of fear. The next, gone, chosen, taken. Even since the rebellion had, rebelled and reclaimed the country, the wealthy had been made to pay, figuratively and literally. Those who had led a golden life, born with a silver spoon in their mouth, were now pariahs. They were the underclass, the ones in fear. The rebellion rose from their ashes like the proverbial phoenix, seizing control of the land, storming the gated communities and country mansions, killing many outright. Those left alive had been evicted from their estates by force, while the rebels took over and moved in. Stately homes, ancestral manors, they all now belonged to the once underprivileged. New laws and rules came to pass. Anyone who tried to stand up to them was executed. They declared it was their time to live like kings. No more welfare, no benefits handed out to those who had lost their riches. Now, they lived in cardboard boxes under bridges and begged for spare change. Lords, baronesses, the nouveau rich. Then there was the game. Heather presumed someone within the rebellion worshipped Richard Bachman, which was ironic, as he was likely now lying in an alleyway somewhere. But unlike his stories, set far away in the future, this was happening right now. And what was behind door number 4? The actual prize up for grabs? Her life. If Heather was able to get through the game, which was almost entirely impossible and definitely rigged, she would be given a free pass to live amongst the rebellion. That was it. No cash prize, no dream holiday, just her life. Of course, the fallen rich had no real idea what the game entailed. They were not permitted access to TV or radio. There were no phones or internet browsers for them. Their sole knowledge of the whole debacle came via word of mouth and the old-fashioned rumor mill. Once a month, a member of the original ruling class was selected to play. It could be anyone. You could not volunteer, nor could a champion take your place. If you refused, you would be executed along with every single member of your family and community. The barbaric, fatal punishment had been sanctioned once so far. The image of 17 innocents hung, drawn and quartered, was burned into Heather's retinas. Never could she forget the sounds and smells from that day. Ripping, tearing, choking, gurgling, and wetness. Even worse, the cheers and laughter from the executioners. And so, when Heather had been chosen, she'd stood tall when the guarded and armed announcer called her name. She'd taken one last look at her ailing parents, bowed her head, and, without a word, had left to do her duty. Now, the vehicle began to slow. They appeared to have reached their final destination. After wiping the windows she'd fogged up with her breath, she noticed what looked like to be a deserted football stadium. The rebellion despised any kind of celebrity status. Their decree ensured almost everyone famous had been removed. Those who earned millions kicking a ball around were some of the first to be disposed of. Thus, their multi-purpose all-weather stadiums were more or less desolate. Except, it would appear, when in use for the game. Flinging the car door open, her captors dragged Heather out and through the entrance onto the pitch. Boggy and fetid dirt replaced the once pristine grass. Flies swarmed around the large, dark patches, the smell not dissimilar to those 17 rotting, disemboweled corpses. Stifling a scream, Heather tried in desperation not to belie her terror. It would do her no good. She might have no idea what awaited her, but she would never give them the satisfaction of seeing her sweat. Back home, in the compound, the rumors were abundant. The rebellion captured lions, paying homage to the Roman times and making the chosen one fight to the death. A glorified fight club, where the opponent wore spiked armor, giving the defendant no chance of surviving. They bred mutants, created zombies, starved men to the brink of cannibalism. No one knew for certain, but Heather had played hundreds of nightmare-fueled scenarios through her mind. It seemed just moments ago her name had been called, yet now it was time to discover the truth of what terror she would face. Her lie, an unready body, shivered in the cold as mist drifted across the grounds, clinging to anything to help her cope. She pictured her father reading, her head resting upon his lap as he stroked her hair. The only solace she could find was the hope her parents wouldn't suffer. The rebellion members marched her into the middle of the football pitch and then raced back to the inner sanctum of the covered pavilion. Heather looked in every direction, a million prospects running through her mind. Would they release some sort of monster now? Would she try to fight, or just let it maul and devour her? Panic began to set in. She was rooted to the spot, quivering in fear. She was startled out of her stupor by an ominous sound to her left. Wide-eyed, she spun in the direction of the noise. It seemed oddly familiar, although the setting was all wrong. And how could they even capture and train? No. Every single messed up scenario she had imagined now paled in insignificance. Nothing could have prepared her for the reality of the situation. She dropped to her knees, praying, begging. "Oh, please, please, no," she screamed. "I'll do anything, please, not this, not..." She didn't have the chance to finish her sentence. Stark realization weighed heavy upon her. No prize existed. There had never been a chance of winning and survival. Her death served purely as entertainment for the rebellion. Ripped apart and eaten alive, her final, dying thought was simply, why? Applauding another sacrificial feeding, the rebellion cheered with gusto before returning to their pillaged homes. In 1 month, the master would choose another. Until then, they would celebrate. What do you think Heather had to face? Can you ever imagine living in a dystopian world like this? Have you ever had to play a game or face a real consequence? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sandalo and Calvin Linderman.